Supervolcanoes erupt once every 600,000 years or so, and we're overdue for one of those. The Yellowstone supervolcano is a ticking time bomb that could blow at any moment. But what would happen if it did? We know there would be devastation in the immediate vicinity of the eruption, but what about the rest of us? How would life go on? One thing's for sure, finding food would become a lot harder. Here are just a few ways that a Yellowstone eruption would affect our food supply. The agriculture industry relies heavily on just a few key crops to feed the world. Corn, wheat, and soy account for roughly half of the calories consumed worldwide. These crops also provide the basis for many animal feeds. If the Yellowstone supervolcano were to erupt today, these plants would likely be among the first casualties. So how exactly would the eruption impact them? In the immediate aftermath, ash would blanket large portions of the U.S., covering farmland from coast to coast. This ash contains very small particles of rock and glass, and depending on its concentration, it can have a range of negative effects on plants. In lower concentrations, the ash may even help fertilize the soil, providing a boost to crop yields. But a supervolcanic eruption is not a mild event. The rock and glass particles in the ash are huge. They'd smother plants, blocking sunlight and preventing photosynthesis. Even if the ash were somehow cleared off the fields, the damage would already be done. Yellowstone is an area full of geysers and hot springs. The water from these features is heated by the magma chamber below and sustained by the constant upwelling of groundwater. But during an eruption, the familiar sights and sounds of Yellowstone would vanish. Most of the geysers and hot springs rely on the pressure created by the magma hundreds of feet below the surface. Without the pressure created by the magma, the water table in the region would collapse. No more water means no more Old Faithful. And without the heat provided by the magma, the water remaining in the area would no longer be heated, turning Yellowstone from a geothermal wonderland into a barren wasteland. In addition to blanketing the United States with ash, a Yellowstone eruption would also send huge ash clouds into the atmosphere. As these clouds spread around the globe, they would reflect sunlight away from the Earth, causing average global temperatures to plummet. Since corn, wheat, and soybeans all grow in temperate climates, the sudden drop in temperature would alter their growing seasons and reduce yields. But some plants do better in cooler climates. Potatoes, for example, grow best in cooler temperatures, and a Yellowstone eruption could mean an increase in potato yields. However, other factors, such as a loss of sunlight due to ash clouds, would likely prevent this boon to potato production from lasting long. But crops aren't the only part of the food chain that would suffer during a Yellowstone eruption. Livestock would also be hard hit. Cows, pigs, and chickens would lose weight and stop producing meat and dairy products. Egg production would plummet as birds abandon their nests and fly away. A Yellowstone eruption would quickly lead to severe shortages of animal products. It would also disrupt aquaculture. Catfish and tilapia are commonly farmed around the world. And like all animals, these fish would struggle to survive in the face of climate change and scarcity of food. But a Yellowstone eruption would also introduce another threat to aquaculture: ash fallout. Fish hatcheries that receive ash fallout would see their fish populations devastated. For example, in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted in Washington state. Ash fell over an area of 230,000 square miles and killed thousands of salmon. This was a relatively small eruption compared to what would come out of Yellowstone. Its effects on the local salmon population were devastating. A Yellowstone eruption would have far-reaching consequences for fish hatcheries around the world. Food shortages would drive up grocery prices and lead to panic buying. During the COVID-19 pandemic, toilet paper shortages led to panic buying in many countries. Shortages of other essential goods followed as people began to stock up. A Yellowstone eruption would likely have a similar effect, but on a much larger scale. People would begin to panic buy their favorite foods, which would cause prices to skyrocket and empty shelves to become the norm. Even if people could afford food at the grocery store, they might not find the items they want. The agricultural industry has moved toward standardization in recent decades. This means that there are fewer varieties of each crop grown around the world. For example, 90% of the corn grown in the United States is dent corn, which is used primarily for animal feed. A Yellowstone eruption would devastate the dent corn crops and lead to major shortages. There would be no quick fix either. With food supply chains broken and transportation routes disrupted, it would take months or even years for new crops to be planted, harvested, and processed. So consumers would be stuck with whatever food they had on hand when the eruption occurred. Decades ago, most countries had a stockpile of food that could be used in the event of an emergency. These supplies were intended to get people through natural disasters and wars. Unfortunately, these stockpiles have dwindled in recent years, in part because of short-sighted government policies and in part because of the belief that food shortages are a thing of the past. But a Yellowstone eruption would change that perception quickly. Countries would immediately begin drawing down their emergency food reserves, but these supplies would quickly be exhausted. The result would be widespread famine. A Yellowstone eruption would not only kill people directly, but indirectly as well. Global temperatures would drop and winter would last longer. These changes would have a profound impact on agriculture. Farmers would have to abandon crops that could not withstand frost and look for new crops to replace them. In some regions, farming as we know it might even end. But farmers are a hardy bunch. They are used to fighting against the elements to put food on the table. They would almost certainly rise to the challenge presented by a Yellowstone eruption and find ways to feed the world, but not without some losses. Ranching and meat production would be among the hardest hit industries. Ranchers rely on predictable weather patterns to keep their herds healthy and growing. An eruption at Yellowstone would throw these patterns out the window. Ranchers would be forced to make tough decisions about how to feed and care for their animals. In the end, many ranches would go out of business and millions of cattle, pigs and sheep would be lost. In addition to the loss of life, there would also be a loss of culture. Many indigenous groups depend on the land for more than just food. Hunting and fishing are important parts of their cultures. A Yellowstone eruption would disrupt these activities and lead to the loss of important cultural practices. Of course, the impact of a Yellowstone eruption would not be limited to the United States. Countries around the world would feel the effects of the eruption in different ways. Some countries would experience colder winters and others would see more rain. Some countries would see an increase in pests and diseases, and still others would experience drought. All of these changes would have an impact on agriculture and food production. In the developing world, the impact would be especially severe. These countries rely heavily on rain for agriculture and are already struggling to feed their populations. A Yellowstone eruption would push many of these countries over the edge, leading to widespread famine and chaos. A Yellowstone eruption would also have a major impact on the price of food. The cost of food would skyrocket as supplies dwindled and demand increased. This would lead to social unrest as people took to the streets to protest the high prices. Some countries might even collapse as a result of the economic and social upheaval. So what could we do to mitigate the damage? One option would be to use genetically engineered crops. These crops have been modified to resist pests, diseases, and extreme weather conditions. They could potentially provide a stable food supply during a Yellowstone eruption. But there are risks associated with genetically engineered crops. Some people believe that they are not safe to eat, and others worry about the environmental impacts. Another option would be to rely on insects and other sources of protein. Insects are a good source of protein and could potentially help people survive a Yellowstone eruption. But in many countries, insects are not considered food, and people would have to be convinced to eat them. Ultimately, a Yellowstone eruption would be a disaster on a scale not seen in modern times. It would lead to food shortages, economic chaos, and social unrest. The impact would be felt around the world, and there would be no easy way to recover. But humans are a resilient species, and we would eventually recover from the eruption. We would learn to grow new crops, find new sources of protein, and rely less on the agricultural industry. But the road to recovery would be long and difficult. Now watch. Is the world ending? These are the top 5 most dangerous volcanoes on Earth. Or check out, why hasn't the government told us about aliens?